We have been watching the Olympics with much interest and excitement in our house. Well, I guess you could say Vince is excited for the Olympics, whether it's summer or winter, and since being married to him for a while now, I've started to catch that excitement as well. It is something that is both at the same time, it is something that is both the same and traditional, and yet changing from year to year. The Olympics are full of time-honored traditions that stand side by side with trailblazing new technology in all of the sports equipment. Seasoned medalists stand next to hope-filled young first-timers. It's an event with a story that is much bigger than itself. A story that contains both a history and a future. So often, as those young hopefuls are interviewed, they make reference to another athlete that they admire and have followed after. A legendary medal winner who inspired them to get up every day and keep training and striving. It seems that with each Olympics, there is a passing of the torch, not just in that literal sense, but also metaphorically. The long-standing leaders in a sport taking one final bow, and the new leaders climbing onto the podium with a new record-breaking time. But in the midst of these spectacular displays of finely honed skill and physical endurance are real human stories. Stories of humble beginnings, stories of tragic setbacks, and stories of miraculous recoveries. And yet each one of those stories is part of that bigger Olympic story. Each one connected to the bigger story of the ideals of what it means to enter the arena of competition in the pursuit of excellence, friendship, and fair play. A bigger vision for countries that are in so many ways opposed politically to one another, but then come together in unity and under the umbrella of peace, something that goes beyond those other differences. Well, last week, Pastor Randy began his sermon by announcing that we have a great big God. And we also have a God that comes to us in a very particular and intimate way, in the flesh, as Jesus. Our great big God, majestic creator of all things, is also the person of Jesus, coming to that bedside of a woman with a fever, lifting her out of the illness to return to her life, and calling to care for others. And now this week, it seems that the image of our great big God and our intimate Jesus collide together in one story on the mountaintop. And then paired with the event of the story from Kings, the one detailing the passing of the mantle from Elijah to Elisha, well, then we begin to see that our great big God has a great big story. A great big story that knits together all the intimate stories, all of God's encounters with God's people. But first we look at 2 Kings. It's a time closer to the beginning of God's great big story, an event that happened long before the Transfiguration of Jesus, and yet tied to it in some subtle ways. Elijah, the great prophet, and his disciple Elisha know that the time for God to take Elijah up is coming soon. That very day, in fact. And it's no secret. The community of prophets in several places all seem to have this same information. Elijah, ever faithful, is continuing to follow God's calling even in this last and final day. And his own faithful disciple is determined to stick right alongside him. Traveling from place to place, Elisha repeatedly denies his teacher's suggestions that he stay behind. Time is short. The Lord could act at any moment, and Elisha wants to be with him all he can. And everyone seems to be finding it necessary to remind him of Elijah's impending departure. His response, I know. Shh, keep silent. It isn't denial so much as I think just an honest expression of Elisha wishing it wasn't true. That despite the warning, he's still not prepared. He can't be prepared. He doesn't want his time with his teacher to come to an end. But now comes the tie-in to that larger, bigger story. The larger one that encompasses this smaller drama taking place. We hear that Elijah takes off his mantle. And in doing so, he strikes the waters of the Jordan, and they part, and he and Elisha cross to dry land. And we instantly are taken back to Moses and the Exodus, the parting of the sea, and God's gift of freedom. We're reminded that God is at work, pushing this big story, this narrative forward. God's good future comes. It brings change, but it always comes as promised. And the great big story and all of God's promises, connecting everything together. It seems Elijah, too, is touched by this inevitable departure. And so he tenderly asks what he can do for his disciple, this one who is really more like a son to him. Elisha wisely asks for a double share of his teacher's spirit, knowing full well that if he is to carry on, well, then he will surely need it. This prophet's shoes will not be easy ones in which to walk. Well, finally, the moment arrives, and with it comes a great big display. Chariots and horses of fire and a powerful whirlwind sweeping Elijah away, and Elisha crying out after him, Father, Father, and tearing his garments in two as an act of deep grief. Now, the reading we heard ends there, but if we were to continue on in the story, we would see Elisha pick up that mantle of his teacher, and then part the river of Jordan himself and cross back over. And we would hear the other prophets witness to this passing on of Elijah's spirit to him. God driving that story forward, changing the scenery, the show of God's glory put aside for now, and the everyday life of discipleship and servanthood coming back to the forefront. Elisha carrying on. So now to the mountaintop, to Jesus and Peter, James, and John. They go up the mountain perhaps to pray, or maybe specifically for this awesome encounter to take place. And suddenly Jesus is transfigured. The disciples see a dazzling light, Jesus shining brighter than anything the human eye has ever seen. Their teacher and friend now revealed to them in an undeniable way as the Messiah that they thought him to be. Jesus is not alone. He's part of a shining trio. He's bookended by Moses and Elijah, two of the greatest figures of Israel's past. Moses, who parted the waters and led God's people to freedom. Elijah, the prophet, who counseled kings, healed the sick, and survived persecution. God's great big story is represented there on the mountaintop. The faithfulness of God across hundreds of years displayed in that all-star lineup. And then there's Peter. Dear Peter, trying to somehow mark this moment, to make it last, his instincts to stay and build tabernacles to worship in the presence of the holiness of this great big God. And in Peter, I'm reminded of Elisha and his desire to stick close to his master and mentor. His gentle expressions of, "I know, keep silent," to those who would remind him of Elijah's leaving. But no, this is not a moment meant to last in anything but memory. And as if the dazzling display wasn't enough, now a cloud and a great big voice from above seal the deal. "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Now we flash back to the banks of the Jordan River, where John baptized Jesus. And then maybe a faint flash back even further, that flash of Elijah parting the river Jordan, and then Moses parting the sea. It's a big story, a big, big story. Well, now only Jesus remains. He is as they have always seen him, and yet they will never see him the same again, carrying the memory of the Transfiguration. That moment highlighting the collision of their great big God and this flesh and bone Messiah with whom they walk and talk and eat and sleep. Down from the mountaintop to the valley, but to tell no one. Well, at least not until Jesus dies and is raised again, as he tells him he will do. The disciples following Jesus back down the mountain toward more healings, toward confrontations with authority, and toward the inevitable cross. Both of today's stories are connected to that bigger story of God. One with a yesterday, a today, and a tomorrow. God's big story extending from before time began all the way to a future time of that only God knows for sure. And it's a story that is alive, always moving forward. God pushes that big story forward, though, in a very particular way, through the lives of God's people. As Elisha picks up that mantle and carries on, as the disciples travel back on down the mountaintop. And you and I, we continue the story. We who are followers of Jesus in our baptism, we are also called God's beloved. And we are given his mantle and a double share of his spirit. That great big story is ours. And we're made a part of something that's so much bigger than ourselves. A story of mercy and love and freedom and grace. A story where a great big God shows up in close and personal ways in our lives and then through us in the lives of others. This is a story that our own story is woven into. Your story with all its ups and downs, moments on the mountain and long days in the valley. God is moving in it, driving it forward into a future that's filled with promises of healing and redemption and hope. Both the written story and the story we live, connected always to those on whose shoulders we stand, and connected to a future being built for those who will one day soon stand on our shoulders. We are at the same time recipients of all God has promised, and we are keepers, holders, rememberers of God's promises. In remembrance of me, Jesus says. Remember the bigger story to which you belong. Remember that all of your stories collide within God's big story, connected to one another in something that overarches everything else. A big umbrella of a story gathering us in. Visions of God, forever changing our vision of the world. Seeing what we have seen, followers must become leaders, serving for the sake of telling the story. Just last Thursday, over 200 members of congregations from across our synod participated in Lutheran Day on the Hill, gathering in Des Moines to speak with their legislators and then pointing toward the story as advocates for those in poverty. This evening, we will help feed folks down at First Pres. And in a little over a week, we begin to host Family Promise again. What other ways do you lead? And how will you lead as you follow this great story into God's good future? Pointing others to God's promise of hope and healing and freedom for all. Leaders pointing always to the story, the big story, the story of our God, and the moments when God shows up in great, big, bright, shining ways, and then in the smallest, most personal moments of healing. Go out with good courage. You are followers who lead. The Lord is with you. Amen.